My wife Lynn and I have shared 6 seemingly ordinary years together, culminating in 11 months of marriage. Our history has been a serene stream of normalcy, void of any peculiar behaviors or ominous sign. The unsettling reality of the current situation lies in its stark deviation from her established character. Lynn, typically a paragon of kindness, intelligence, and thoughtfulness, has never dabbled in the realm of childish pranks or attempts to invoke fear. Even the prospect of watching horror movies is a terrain she avoids, as demonstrated by her harrowing experience with The Shining during our early days of courtship. It's important to note that she has never harbored an interest in anything remotely eerie or played with the notion of pranks. This sudden departure from her usual demeanor is what magnifies the disconcerting nature of the situation. Adding to the mystique, Lynn has never grappled with mental health issues, and to the best of my knowledge, it doesn't run in her family. While some people might adeptly conceal their mental struggles, the 6 years of shared life should have unraveled some telltale signs if this were the case. The ominous episode unfurled 2 months ago as I hastily prepared my morning coffee in the kitchen. Running late for work and unable to swing by Dunkin' Donuts for my usual caffeine fix, I took a hurried sip as I navigated towards the front door. It was then that I glimpsed Lynn, her eyes peering at me from behind a corner, a solitary strand of her dark hair cascading against the wall. Her concealed form sent shivers down my spine, causing me to nearly spill my coffee and, in the process, scald my lips in the wake of this uncharacteristic and spine-chilling encounter. "Geez, Lynn," I exclaimed, hastily wiping a few stray coffee drops from my pants. "You scared the living daylights out of me." Like a mischievous child caught in the act, Lynn promptly vanished from view. The hurried scuffling of her footsteps echoed towards the living room, and by the time I reached the front door, she had seamlessly eluded my sight. The whole episode, while undeniably bizarre and contrary to her usual demeanor, carried a peculiar charm. It was a deviation from her usual seriousness, and despite my initial shock, I couldn't help but find amusement in her newfound playfulness. Shouting declarations of love and teasing her as a weirdo, I closed the door behind me, accompanied by the faint echoes of her laughter. While her behavior was perplexing, it didn't warrant summoning a priest. I brushed it off by lunchtime, and upon returning home, Lynn appeared to have reverted to her usual self. The incident remained unspoken between us, and life continued without dwelling on the strange occurrence. The subsequent unsettling event unfolded 3 days later. Around 2, stirred from sleep, I found myself at the kitchen island, jug of orange juice in hand, sensing an eerie gaze fixated on me. A disconcerting feeling led my gaze downward, revealing Lynn's grinning face peering up from the other side of the island. Her wide, unblinking eyes mirrored the unsettling grin of the Cheshire cat. I couldn't stifle a scream, not out of irritation, but genuine fear. In that moment, an unexplainable terror overcame me. At the sound of my scream, Lynn hastily retreated, moving on all fours with hands and feet smacking against the tile floor until she disappeared from the kitchen. Frozen in shock, I remained in place, pondering the inexplicable impulse that drove her to such eerie antics. It took more time than I'd care to admit before I mustered the courage to return upstairs. Upon reaching our bedroom, Lynn lay on her side, seemingly asleep or at least feigning slumber. I stood there watching her rhythmic breathing, skeptical and half expecting her to spring into action the moment I entered the bed. Yet she remained motionless, breathing softly and deeply, leaving me to question whether I had merely dreamt the entire chilling episode. The following morning, as we gathered for our routine coffee, I handed her a mug and planted a kiss on her cheek before broaching the unsettling events of the night before. "What was that about last night?" I queried, choosing a light tone to avoid offense or embarrassment. Her reaction was puzzling, a furrowed brow and a dismissive shake of the head as if my words were a riddle she couldn't solve. "You were peeking at me again." From over there I pointed to the spot near the kitchen island. She followed my gaze, and when she looked back at me, an eruption of laughter spilled from her. It was infectious, and soon enough I found myself joining in. "You creep me out sometimes, you know that," I remarked, to which she responded with a playful giggle, placing her cup on the counter before wrapping her arms around my neck. You creep me out all the time. So I guess we're even, she teased. After exchanging our goodbyes, we set off for work. However, the eerie image of her grinning from behind the island lingered in my thoughts. The haunting sounds of her hands on the floor as she crawled away replayed in my mind. I reassured myself that she was merely attempting to inject some playfulness into our lives, perhaps trying to align with my love for all things horror. I soon noticed her penchant for peeking escalating. Sometimes she'd be surreptitiously observing me from behind the living room curtains or the edges of the couch. The most disconcerting instance was when she managed to cram herself into her grandmother's old trunk at the foot of our bed. Only the creaking hinges betrayed her presence. A face, grinning with the enthusiasm of a child, peered out from the slightly ajar lid. It was unnerving, and I found myself at a loss for words. As I finally spoke, questioning her peculiar behavior, she remained silent, slowly closing the lid and then closing herself inside the trunk. I walked away, disturbed by the encounter, grappling with the inexplicable nature of her action. While I couldn't fathom the motive behind her unsettling game, it was evident that it brought her joy. I could only hope that this eerie phase would run its course sooner rather than later. For the next 2 weeks, Lynn refrained from her peculiar peeking antics, leading me to believe that her bizarre prank had come to an end. A sense of relief washed over me, and during a Netflix binge one evening, I playfully remarked that I hadn't caught her spying lately, suggesting she might have abandoned her spy game. She met my comment with a small smile and cryptically replied, "Maybe I've just gotten better at it." Her words lingered in my mind, leaving me to wonder whether she was joking or not. Over the next few days, the nagging thought took root. Was she still observing me when I least expected it? The paranoia set in, making me hyper-aware of my surroundings. I became jumpy when she wasn't in plain view, constantly checking behind corners and doors. And I began questioning my own sanity. After a few incident-free weeks, I started to ease back into a semblance of normalcy. The routine checks behind furniture and walls ceased, and I convinced myself that it was just a bizarre phase better left as a distant memory. Then, a few days ago, everything took a terrifying turn. Lynn left for a friend's gathering, and I lounged on the couch, engrossed in a couple of laptop games. Around 9 p.m. I decided to take a shower. As I washed the soap from my hair, an eerie sensation crept over me, the unmistakable feeling of being watched. Slowly opening my eyes, I was met with a horror that sent my heart racing. Lynn was peeking from behind the shower curtain, her entire head thrust into the shower, leaving just her soaked body outside. Her long, dark hair clung to the curtain, water dripping from the end. Her mouth hung open in a grotesque grin, eyes wide and bloodshot, as if she hadn't blinked in ages. I screamed and recoiled against the wall, but she remained motionless, the eerie smile on her face undeterred. Black streaks of mascara ran down her cheeks, and in that moment she looked both giddy and completely unhinged. Fear gripped me in its icy hold, and I was utterly terrified. The tension in the bathroom hung thick, our silent standoff lasting an agonizing few moments. Eventually, as if dragging time itself, Lynn slowly withdrew her head from the shower. I observed her distorted figure through the wet curtain as she retreated towards the bathroom door. With a resounding slam that rattled the mirror, the door closed forcefully, prompting another terrified scream from me. Jumping out of the shower, I hastily locked the door and remained inside for what felt like an eternity. Perhaps to some, my reaction might have seemed exaggerated, but whether a joke or not, I had reached my limit with the unsettling antics. That's what I kept telling myself as I paced within the confines of my bathroom, pausing intermittently to listen at the door. Suddenly, a muffled sound reached my ears, prompting me to press against the door, straining to discern any noise. In my mind's eye, I pictured Lynn on the other side, reveling in her prank with suppressed giggles. Anger surged within me. The fear of being scared in my own home and spending an hour in hiding overwhelmed me. "What the hell, Lynn?" I snapped. This nonsense is beyond infuriating. Expecting either an apology or a retort, I was met with a faint moan, so subtle that I questioned whether it had occurred at all, followed by an eerie silence. "Lynn," I called out, unable to conceal the tremor in my voice. No response but the echo of my own labored breathing. "Freaking stop it," I yelled, pounding my fist against the door. Awaiting a verbal confrontation, I was met with nothing but the occasional drip from the shower head. I won't deny it. Fear took hold. Terrified at the prospect of confronting my own wife, I waited another excruciating 30 minutes, which felt like an eternity in my state of distress. Finally deciding that I wouldn't spend the night cowering in my bathroom, I sank to my knees and peered beneath the door. A flicker of dread crossed my mind as I half expected to see her face staring back at me, but thankfully it was absent. The hallway stretched before me, leading to the top of the stairs, yet there was no sign of Lynn. Uncertain whether relief or unease should prevail, I scrutinized the space, anticipating her head to emerge over the top step, but it never materialized. Standing up, my hand hovered over the door, mentally bracing myself to open it. Shaky fingers slowly turned the lock, and just as I was about to yank it open, a gut-wrenching sound halted me in my tracks. A moan, more pronounced than before, echoed through the room, and this time I pinpointed its origin. Turning my head in slow motion, I locked eyes with my wife, who was peeking out from the slight gap of the closet door. Her eyes remained wide, her mouth contorted into the most grotesque, gaping smile I had ever witnessed. There was no scream. Fear had gripped me too tightly. Her hands clasped to her chest. Her body trembled with sheer delight as if she could barely contain her excitement. A raspy moan emanated from her throat, deep and raw, sending a shiver down my spine. Summoning the courage, I flung the bathroom door open and sprinted down the stairs. Snagging my keys and phone from the living room table, I dashed outside to my car. A shrill laughter followed me, but I couldn't discern if it was getting closer. I left the front door wide open, drove away from the house faster than legal, shivering, whether from fear or cold, perhaps both. I hadn't bothered to grab a coat or shoes, still clad in just my boxers with damp hair. I drove straight to my brother Chris's house, about 40 minutes away, ignoring every call and text I received. I didn't check my phone until safely parked in his driveway. Lynn had called 4 times and sent a flurry of texts, questioning my sudden departure. Her nonchalant attitude fueled my rage, and I hurled my phone at the dash. My brother and his wife were taken aback by my unexpected visit, especially in my limited attire. They offered support, with Chris lending me some clothes and inquiring about the vague fight with Lynn. I refrained from delving into the unsettling details, not wanting my brother to think I was overreacting to a mere prank, even if it was an utterly bizarre one. After all, hadn't I urged Lynn for years to lighten up? I had hoped she would relax, but this was certainly not what I had in mind. Attempting to sleep on their sofa proved futile. Every time I closed my eyes, Lynn's haunting face materialized, staring at me from inside the closet. The realization that she had never left the bathroom, instead slipping into the closet and slamming the door to deceive me, sent shivers down my spine. The prospect of returning home filled me with anxiety, leaving me tossing and turning through the night. Chris eventually gave me a sleeping pill, granting me some reprieve, albeit filled with nightmares featuring Lynn's smiling visage. I awoke as the sun began to rise, my body sore from the uncomfortable sofa, feeling utterly drained. I knew I had to call Lynn at some point, but the thought left me at a loss for words. I couldn't fathom going back home unless she assured me she would cease her eerie antics. All I yearned for was my wife's return to her normal, serious self, a version of her I had never appreciated more. Contemplating calling her with these thoughts in mind, the familiar feeling of being watched overcame me. My heart raced as I stared at the ceiling, reluctant to turn my gaze away. However, the sensation intensified the longer I resisted. My eyes drifted from the ceiling, almost involuntarily. There, pressed against the window beside the couch, was Lynn's face, staring down at me with the same unsettling smile. Drool streaked down her lips, leaving long marks on the glass. I didn't know how long she had been there, but a gnawing suspicion suggested it might have been all night. Anger eclipsed any fear I felt at that moment, and I jumped from the couch, pounding my palm against the glass. "Lynn, are you crazy? What the hell is wrong with you? Just go home, now!" I shouted. She remained unmoving, her eerie expression undeterred. If anything, her smile seemed to grow, as if she reveled in her unsettling behavior. I could hear Chris and his wife moving around upstairs. Lynn's head twitched slightly in their direction. She slowly closed her mouth. Chris called my name, from upstairs, clearly concerned. When I turned to see him and Rebecca hurrying down the steps, Lynn was gone. The only evidence of her presence was the 2 streaks of drool still clinging to the glass. Attempting to explain the bizarre encounter to Chris and Rebecca proved challenging. They were understandably skeptical. Outside, we found no footprints in the dirt, just a slight indent. Chris suggested an animal, and I didn't contest. They assumed it was all a dream, but the truth was far too bizarre for them to grasp, and I lacked the energy to convince them otherwise. I called in sick that day and turned off my cell, avoiding the impending conversation with Lynn that felt too overwhelming at that moment. The belief that something irreversibly wrong had taken hold of her grew, and the realization that no promises could restore our relationship saddened me to my core. Most of the morning was spent in tears, grappling with the profound shift in our dynamic. By noon, I convinced myself it was time to confront her. I turned my phone back on, greeted by dozens of texts from Lynn, all portraying a seemingly concerned wife. "Can we talk? I love you. Please call me. I'm really worried. Can you answer? Just come home." Despite her expressions of love and concern, not a single text addressed the bizarre antics she had pulled, the unnerving actions reminiscent of a Stephen King novel. Even her texts seemed different, terse, and lacking the usual verbosity, especially considering her penchant for sending lengthy messages about mundane matters. I stayed with Chris and Rebecca for another night, thankfully avoiding Lynn's face watching me through the window upon waking up yesterday afternoon. Rebecca, sensing the tension, broached the subject cautiously during lunch. "I don't want to pry, but is this something that can be mended?" "I don't know. She's like a different person," I replied, withholding the full extent of the unsettling experiences. "People change, Ben, but she's still the same woman you married. Maybe talking through your issues could help. Whatever's going on, I'm sure it can be fixed," Rebecca offered. "I think it's beyond that now. I just don't trust her," I admitted, the words heavy with the realization that living in constant fear was not an option. "Lynn loves you. She has to be absolutely crushed," Rebecca commented. "I don't know about that," I replied, uncertain of Lynn's true feelings. "Well, she certainly seemed like it to me. I've never seen her so upset. Very much unlike the Lynn I know," Rebecca remarked, shaking her head sadly. Her words sank in slowly, and a sense of dread crept over me. "Wait, what do you mean? You saw her? You saw Lynn?" I asked, my mouth dry with anxiety. Rebecca casually confirmed the unnerving fact that Lynn had stopped by that morning just after Chris left for work. The revelation sent shivers down my spine. She hadn't come inside, but the encounter left me scrutinizing corners, feeling like a prey being hunted. She looked awful, like she hadn't slept in days. "I think you should call her," Rebecca suggested. Thanking her for lunch, I left the table and felt a modicum of relief that Lynn hadn't entered the house. Still, I needed to double-check that the doors were locked. The unease lingered, and the need to confront Lynn became an inevitable task hovering on the horizon. I sat for a while contemplating my next steps. The reluctance to return home warred with a sense of obligation towards Lynn, driven by the vows of love and honor through sickness and health. It was evident she was unwell. Believing Lynn was genuinely sick, I felt compelled to seek help for her. The dilemma was where to start. Calling the police seemed excessive, and what explanation could I offer? That my wife was peeking at me, the bizarre nature of her actions didn't constitute a crime, at least not yet. It felt wrong, dangerous, as if something sinister hid beneath her unsettling smile. Aware of my rights as her husband, including the option to have her committed, I grappled with the uncertainty of her behavior in the presence of professionals. She had already deceived Rebecca into thinking she was just a concerned wife. If the doctors didn't perceive her as a threat, they would release her after the mandatory 72 hours. The situation overwhelmed me, leaving me feeling lost. In my predicament, I did what seemed most logical. I called her mother. The prospect of contacting Marianne, Lynn's mother, was far from appealing. Our interactions had been brief, and Marianne's demeanor was often unwelcoming. She rarely smiled, and when she did, only her lips moved into a thin-lipped expression, leaving her eyes cold and indifferent. Despite her disapproval of me, we had limited contact, and I was grateful for our geographical distance. However, Desperate times called for desperate measures. Marianne, it's me, Ben. Do you have a minute to talk? I asked, bracing myself for her typical coolness. I'm in the middle of writing some checks, but if you insist, I suppose I can spare a moment. What is it that you want to discuss, Benjamin? She responded, already sounding irritated. It's about Lynn. She's been acting strangely, and I was wondering if you had any idea whether there was something I started but was abruptly interrupted. It's a bit difficult to follow your rambling, Benjamin. What is it that you want from me? She asked, her tone chilly. I wanted to know if you'd ever noticed any odd behavior or possibly any mental health issues, I inquired, sensing an uncomfortable pause before she responded. I'm not sure if this is one of your jokes, Benjamin, but if so, I don't find the humor in it. Now, I do have business to attend to, as I've said, so if you don't mind, she began, but I cut her off before she could dismiss me. Marianne, it's not a joke. I'm sincerely concerned about Lynn's mental health. Her behavior has been very erratic lately. I'm very worried about her, and I figured as her mother you would be as well, I said, frustration evident in my voice. If you're truly concerned, then I suggest you get the health professionals involved. I don't know what you expect of me, she snapped. I could sense she was seconds away from hanging up, and for some reason, I was desperate not to let her. I had the feeling that she knew a lot more than she was letting on. Please, if not for me, do it for Lynn, I pleaded. I heard a faint, shaky intake of breath as if she were trying to hold her steely persona together but failing. Marianne, what's I started. Benjamin, I don't know what to tell you. My only advice would be to seek professional help. Do not call here again. Goodbye, she concluded, and I tried to call out to her, but she had already hung up. I attempted to wrap my head around the call and her refusal to help me. Even if she didn't like me, why wouldn't you want to help her own daughter? I couldn't understand that. I tried to replay the conversation, desperate to find something I missed. After a while, I almost gave up until I remembered her last words to me. Seek professional help. She had said those words with a bit of urgency. I could have just been grasping at straws, but no, I was sure her voice had changed ever so slightly when she'd said that, as if they were very important. What had she meant? I assumed she'd been referring to medical professionals, but maybe she was referring to someone else. Someone that she didn't, for some reason, feel comfortable saying directly. Or maybe I was just desperate. I waited for Chris to get home, and after a very long and exhausting conversation with him and Rebecca, I convinced them that Lynn truly needed psychiatric help. I didn't tell them everything. I wasn't prepared to go into it yet, but I told them about our last encounter, how she had hidden in the bathroom peeking at me from the closet. They were obviously shocked, but thankfully they believed me. They too just wanted to help her. Still, they didn't think it was all that serious. Weird, maybe, but not dangerous. They just kept saying that Lynn had to be playing some kind of weird joke. Maybe for YouTube, Rebecca offered, if only half-heartedly. Chris didn't think we should involve the police just yet. He offered instead to go with me, and I readily accepted. He reasoned that calmly talking to her, trying to coax her into going willingly, was the best recourse. I agreed to do it his way. At least I wouldn't be going into that house alone. We drove over this morning just after breakfast. There was no way I was going at night. When we pulled into the driveway, my stomach began doing somersaults. Her car wasn't there, but I still didn't let my guard down. The front door was ajar, and for a split second I thought we'd see her eyes staring through the gap. I was shaking and starting to sweat. Chris, however, was fine. He waited for me to open the door, his hands in his pockets like he was going on a stroll through the park. I envied his ignorance. I pushed the door open and was immediately hit with the stench of rot. Chris smelled it too, and he walked in the house behind me with his nose scrunched up. What do you guys use to clean the floors around here? Shit, Chris mumbled. Shut up, I said, my eyes darting around for any signs of Lynn. The house was deadly quiet and dark, despite being 10 in the morning. All the curtains were closed up tight, refusing to allow any sunlight inside. If I hadn't left it just 2 days prior, I'd have thought the house to be abandoned. We moved through each room, carefully checking any place that she might hide, occasionally calling her name. Why the heck are you looking under the couch? Chris asked eventually. Are we looking for your wife? He was looking at me like I was a moron. Let's just go upstairs, I whispered. He shook his head but followed me up the stairs to check the bathroom and spare bedroom. On the way up, my shoes crunched over pieces of glass that looked to be littered over a few of the steps. I noticed that one of Lynn and my wedding portraits that hung on the wall along the staircase had been smashed. The frame hung crookedly, all the glass removed. I stared at the picture, a lump forming in my throat. We had taken the photo just after leaving the church after saying our vows. She looked so beautiful in her white gown. I looked at Lynn's beautiful face. I never dreamed her face would ever be a source of terror for me. We climbed the rest of the steps and checked the spare bedroom, but it looked completely untouched. I was hesitant to go into the bathroom, my fear from that night coming back to me all at once. Chris noticed and offered to go in by himself, but I couldn't let him do that. So we walked in together, checking the closet and the shower. The bathroom looked as if it hadn't been touched since the night I left. I don't think she's here, Ben. Why don't you pack some clothes and we'll try coming back tomorrow or something, Chris said. I nodded and went into our bedroom and shoved some clothes into a duffel bag. When I checked inside our closet, I came across the source of the smell and gagged. Chris took one look and lost all color in his face. He had to go stand by the stairs to get away from the sight and smell. I gazed down in shock at what lay inside my bedroom closet. Soaking into the rug were at least a dozen eyeballs, all carefully laid out in pairs. Some were as large as a quarter, while others were as tiny as a marble. I stared down at the eyes she'd collected from small animals and wondered how she'd gotten them, shuddering at the thought. Man, I thought I had it bad with Becca's shoe addiction. Your wife's in here collecting eyeballs, Chris said, gagging. Ben, I think we should go, he called from the hall. I'm getting nauseous. All right, I grabbed my duffel and shut the closet door on my new nightmare. I stepped out into the hall and took a deep breath of air. I could taste the rot on my tongue and I couldn't help but gag. Who the heck lines up eyeballs in their closet like that? Chris mumbled. I tried to tell you she needed help, I said. She doesn't need help, Ben. She needs a freaking exorcist, he said. You coming or what? I can't stand the smell any. His words died in his throat and his eyes grew wide with fear. I didn't ask him why. I could feel it. Someone was watching me and I didn't think it was the eyes in the closet. I turned around, my eyes slowly scanning the bedroom. Christ, I whispered as I finally saw what we'd missed. Under the bed, curled on her side, watching us with the excitement of a kid on Christmas morning, was my wife. She held her hands together just under her chin and they were shaking eagerly. Now that she knew she'd been found, I could hear the quiet noises she was making, a sort of hiccuping sound in her throat as if the excitement was just too much for her. It was unnerving to say the least. Wide eyes and that same huge smile. Everything in me told me to run, but I forced it away. This was my wife. No matter how twisted, she was still the woman I married. I had to help her. Lynn, I said softly. She didn't respond, but her head bobbed back and forth in two quick little movements as if she were nodding. Baby, I just wanna help, okay? Can you let me do that? I asked. I had taken a single step forward, approaching her like some kind of dangerous animal. I love you, Lynn, I said softly, taking another step closer. She let a tiny moan escape her wide-open mouth, and I had to resist the urge to run. Her shoulders were starting to quiver, and her eyes grew as large as saucers. I crouched down so I could see her better, and immediately saw the blood. Her hands were covered in it. They trembled more the closer I got, as if she was barely able to contain herself. Lynn, are you hurt? You're bleeding, I said. She bobbed her head again, her bloody fingers moving up and down as if playing an invisible piano. They occasionally grazed her chin, leaving smears of blood on her skin. I wanted to recoil in disgust. The smell that was coming off of her was revolting. I could feel the vomit trying to climb up my throat. Her lips were dry and stretched thin, blood seeping between the cracks. I knew she wouldn't come out on her own, but I didn't want to leave her in the state she was in. I scooted closer and reached out to her. The excited hiccuping sounds got louder, and her hands shook, fingers flexing. It was then that I could see the blood oozing from in between her fingers. Oh my God, Lynn, you're bleeding, I said. Instinctively, I reached out to take her hand, but before I could even touch her, her hand sprang out towards me. A sharp pain shot through my arm, and I fell back on my ass. My arm burned, and I could see the blood dripping down onto the carpet. I looked back at her in shock and saw her grinning madly, her fingers clutching a large shard of glass. "You're right in there," Chris asked from behind me. I turned my head slightly and nodded to him, cradling my arm to my chest. When I turned back to face Lynn, I saw that her focus had shifted. She wasn't looking at me anymore, and she wasn't smiling at me anymore either. She was staring past me, her eyes glaring at Chris the way a hungry lion might stare at an antelope. Her mouth was still hanging open, but it was twisted into a snarl. I got to my feet and began walking backward down the hall, afraid to take my eyes off her. "Are you bleeding?" Chris asked. The moment the words left his mouth, Lynn started fast scooting out from under the bed, the glass shard still in her fist. "Chris, run, go," I yelled. He must have been too afraid to move, because a second later I felt my back bump into him. He was still standing at the top of the stairs, staring at the top of the stairs, staring at the horror that was my wife. Lynn had crawled completely out from under the bed and stood in the bedroom doorway, her face twisted in rage. Her whole body was visibly tense. Blood ran down her fingers and onto the floor. "Jesus, Lynn," Chris said, "you, playing hide and seek." I reached back and pushed him towards the steps. "Move your ass, Chris," I said as quietly but firmly as I could. Lynn bobbed her head in fast, sharp motions and began to grin, stretching her mouth open wider and wider so that her chin seemed to touch her chest. I heard Chris mutter a prayer, and then he was running down the stairs. I stood at the top of the steps, stuck between the love for a woman who clearly needed serious help and self-preservation. "I only want to help," I said, choking back tears. Her eyes focused on me once again as she slowly lifted the glass, holding it out in front of her, and then she started sprinting towards me, grinning with utter excitement. Thankfully, my body took over and I flew down the stairs, skipping 2 or 3 at a time. I made it to the front door before I felt her leap onto my back, wrapping her arms around my neck, her open mouth next to my ear so that I could hear those terrible hiccuping sounds up close. I shook her off me, knocking her to the floor. I felt a searing pain in my back as she went, but I tore open the front door and bolted to my car. Chris was standing in the front yard, talking on the phone with the police. I didn't say a word. I just ran to my car and jumped in. Chris took the hint and followed me, still on the line with 911. I watched the rearview mirror, sure I'd see her there running after us, but I never did. I went straight to and got 11 stitches in my arm and 3 on my back. The police asked a lot of questions and went back to the house to do a search, but of course Lynn wasn't there. They advised me to stay with a friend or relative for a while and to file a restraining order as soon as I could, but none of those things would matter. Somehow I just knew. I dropped Chris off at home and went to a motel an hour away. I wanted to put as much distance between me and Lynn as I could. This is where I've been for the last 4 hours. I thought maybe the police would find her, maybe they'd get her the help she desperately needs. But now I don't think so, because 40 minutes ago I got a text from an unknown number. Just 3 words. "I found you," and a picture attached. The picture was dark and grainy, but I instantly knew what it was. There was no mistaking my wife's eye. I started typing this out immediately after. "I don't know what to do. I'm alone and scared, and I can't help but feel that I'm being watched.